All right guys, we're going to have a look at lat bias rows with a chest supported machine row. Now, the great benefit we get from having any form of chest support is that increased ability to not only improve bracing, but also actually to get that counter force from the chest pad to allow us to direct more tension into that target tissue, whether that be any part of the upper back musculature, but in this case we're going to bias the lat specifically. Now, before we get into both the unilateral and bilateral versions, we have to consider the seat height for this. Now, it's not going to be the same for all of the different upper back musculature. We have to be mindful of the arm path and what it is we're actually trying to finish into as far as that end position. So Charlie, you'll see, just move the seat up a little bit. Now what that allows him to do, before we even get him to touch the machine, we can essentially pull his arm back and we can see like what is his end range lat path, and then as a result of that you can just test in the machine what kind of arm path or what height of seat is going to allow you to achieve that end position. And if we were doing something like a rear delt row or an upper back row, we might position the seat a little bit lower to bias that arm path. But in this case, this is ideal for Charlie's setup for his lats. So we're going to get Charlie to start off with bilateral. And what you'll see here is that we've sat his hips just that little bit further back on the seat so that he's kind of almost leaning forward into the chest pad. This is going to allow him to line those lats up in a very favorable line of pull for the resistance. Then, as you'll see here, key cues really are going to be thinking about dragging that elbow down along the floor, and he's also going to be thinking about, with that upper arm, driving it around the rib cage and almost in towards the base of the spine. Now obviously, if you're someone who's got a little bit more muscle bulk, it's not going to be quite as close to the side here, whereas if you're someone with a little less muscle bulk, you might find you're able to keep the elbow very, very, very close. So again, key cues are going to be thinking about driving those elbows down, wrapping around to the base of the spine. A couple of things we don't want to see is we don't want to see ourselves overextend through here, so you can see that excessive extension through the lumbar spine. We don't want that excessive thoracic extension either. The reason why, if you just hold that back position, is that actually when we start extending back and leaning away, we actually start to pull ourselves out a little bit more towards those rear delts, which isn't the goal of this particular exercise. Other mistakes you'll see as well is just driving those arms wide, and again, not biasing the tissues that we're after here. Now, we'll also move now onto the single arm variation. Now, why we might want to do that is when we have bilateral variations, we're never ever going to be able to get quite as short as we can on a single arm variation. The reason why is that you'll see now with Charlie's, as he goes on this left side here, as he goes through that same cue, he set his hips and his rib cage into position, chest pushing into the pad while he pulls back. He's able to drive that elbow more closely into the rib cage to a degree, but he's also able to use just that little bit of lateral flexion and a tiny bit of rotation towards end range, just to allow him to get right into that shortest possible position for this movement. So just one more good rep, Charlie. Now, what we don't want to see is we don't want to see excessive rotation. So if we were to get Charlie to go right to the start, you'll see that he might start rotating through the kind of trunk musculature far too early. And really the goal of the key cue to think about this for single arm variations is think about arm first, and just as you're about at that end range, we can't go any further without the trunk musculature, then we can bring that little bit of lateral flexion and rotation into the mix at the end. And then controlling those eccentrics as well. So just as an additional note, guys, for many of you now, obviously we've got the Prime Fitness seated row here, but most of you might not have access to a machine with variable resistance. Now, if you do have variable resistance, you just have to be mindful which cam setting you want to set at for the goal of the exercise you try to do. You might want to overload that shortened position. You might want just a fairly neutral kind of resistance profile where it's mostly challenging in the middle, or you might want it to drop off considerably into that shortened range. So if you've got the opportunity to manipulate that, just be mindful that you've set that up appropriately first. The second thing we want to consider is the setup. Now, for many individuals, the handles as they are fixed, regardless of how you adjust the seat of the chest pad, it just might not necessarily fit their structure, and it might not also feel very congruent with their kind of wrist joint and elbows and shoulder, etc. So what we have to be mindful of is the use of potentially something like D handles, and I'll get Charlie to attach those now, just to match it up a little bit more and allow a little bit more natural rotation through the wrist. Because for many, the degree of pronation or supination or that fixed wrist position just might not be the most ideal position for that individual or for you as an individual to get into. So the use of the D handles just essentially allows us just that little bit of natural rotation. And it also allows us on machines where we've got a bit more of a kind of wider handle, for example, it allows us to utilize that to actually, like, because you'll notice on this machine here, for example, this grip here is very close and quite narrow actually for some, especially of someone of Charlie's stature, whereas if we're able to use D handles just to move that out a bit more in line with his structure, we can get a far more favorable arm path for him as an individual. So that's just something to bear in mind. If you do want to individualize the grip for your structure, the use of D handles can be massively invaluable.